The gun went off at 2:13 in the morning, and nobody in the emergency wing of St. Mercy Hospital heard it over the thunder. That was the point. Silas Creed had planned everything down to the weather, 3 days watching radar patterns, 2 bribes to hospital security, 1 silencer fitted to a weapon that wouldn't exist by morning. The man he'd just killed was slumped behind a supply cart in the east stairwell, a federal courier who'd made the mistake of thinking a hospital was a safe place to move evidence. Silas stepped over the body without looking down. He never looked down. That was a habit he'd developed young and kept sharp the way other men kept knives. He had less than 4 minutes before the security rotation closed the window. He needed 2. If you've ever stood in a trauma bay at 2 in the morning, not as a patient, not as a visitor, but as the person responsible for keeping a stranger's heart beating while their family waits 20 feet away behind a glass door, then you understand a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It lives behind your eyes. It makes your hands feel like they belong to someone else, even while they're working perfectly. Alara Voss knew that feeling the way she knew her own name. She was 34 years old, 5'4", and had spent the last 11 hours on her feet, moving between bays 2, 7, and 11 like a human bridge between chaos and control. Her scrubs had blood on the left sleeve that wasn't hers. Her hair had escaped its tie an hour ago, and she hadn't stopped long enough to fix it. She was carrying a stainless tray loaded with surgical instruments, forceps, clamps, retractors because the OR on 7 had paged for a restock, and she'd grabbed the task herself since the orderly on rotation had gone quiet for 20 minutes, which meant he was either in the break room or in a bathroom stall, and either way, she wasn't waiting. She came around the corner of the restricted east corridor at a near run. She hit something solid, not a wall. Walls don't grab you. Walls don't exhale. The tray left her hands. The instruments went everywhere, a sharp cascade of metal across marble that sounded in the sudden quiet of the corridor like a small explosion. Alara stumbled back 2 steps and caught herself on the wall with both palms, and when she looked up, she had exactly enough time to register 3 things in sequence. First, every man in the corridor, and there were 6 of them, had a hand on a weapon. Second, the man she'd walked into was not a patient, not a doctor, and not anyone who had any legitimate reason to be standing in the restricted wing of a trauma floor at 2:13 in the morning. Third, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not the reflexive fury of a man whose space had been invaded. Something quieter than that, and more unsettling for the quiet. Dante Rourke was 6'2", and built like someone who had been through enough violence that his body had reorganized itself around it. He was 41, dark-haired, and had a jaw that looked like it had been set wrong after a break and healed harder for it. His suit was charcoal, perfectly cut, and currently had a faint blood smear across the lapel that was not his own. His eyes were the gray of sky before a storm commits to becoming one. Nobody spoke. Alara was very aware that she was standing in a pool of scattered surgical instruments surrounded by armed men, and that the correct response to this situation was probably not the one her body had defaulted to, which was a very unprofessional and very audible, "Oh, God, I'm sorry." Dante wasn't listening to the words. He was looking at her wrist. She'd forgotten she was still wearing it, the hospital bracelet she'd grabbed off the supply desk 2 hours ago, when she'd been temporarily cleared for surgical-level access during this mass casualty intake from the interstate pileup. They'd slapped it on her, and she'd shoved it up under her sleeve and forgotten it entirely. It had slipped back down when she'd put her palms on the wall. Dante looked at her wrist for 3 seconds. His expression did something. She couldn't track some flicker of recognition, or something close to it, moving through him, and then shutting down fast. Then he leaned forward. His voice, when he spoke, was barely audible, not theatrical, not whispered for effect. Whispered because he meant for only her to hear it. Run. The lights went out. Emergency generators at St. Mercy kicked in within 8 seconds mandated by code, maintained quarterly, tested twice a year. 8 seconds of complete darkness in a trauma wing is an eternity. In 8 seconds, a person can move 40 feet at a dead sprint. In 8 seconds, a person can put something in a pocket, pull something from a case, render someone unconscious, and be halfway down a stairwell. Alara ran. She didn't decide to. Her body made the decision before her brain finished processing the instruction, and that gap between hearing the word and choosing to obey it was exactly what Dante had calculated when he said it. He'd needed her moving before she thought about it, because if she'd thought about it, she would have stopped to ask why, and if she'd stopped to ask why, whatever was about to happen in that corridor would have happened around her. When the lights came back up, she was at the end of the hall, behind the nurse's station partition, crouched below the desk with her back against the lower cabinet and her heart making a serious attempt to exit her chest through her sternum. She heard shouting. She heard something fall. She heard the specific, sharp sound of a grown man hitting a floor at speed, which she knew because she'd heard it enough times in the intake bay to have it filed in her memory under sounds that meant the next 60 seconds mattered. Then silence. Then Dante's voice, completely level, giving instructions she couldn't quite hear. She pressed her back harder against the cabinet and tried to get her breathing under control. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them, like they were misbehaving children. 11 years of trauma nursing. She'd had a man die gripping her wrist. She'd talked a teenager through the worst moment of his life, while his organs failed around him. She did not shake. Her hands did not care about her professional history. She was still staring at them when the partition moved. The man who crouched down in front of her was not Dante. He was younger, mid-30s, with a neat scar through one eyebrow and eyes that had the flat professional quality of someone who spent most of their time assessing whether other people were problems. He held both hands slightly away from his body, not raised, just visible, and he spoke quietly. "He wants you to come with us." "I don't think I want to do that," Alara said. "3 of our men are down. Someone used the blackout to take a case from our security convoy. Footage from the corridor camera." He paused. "It shows you." Alara stared at him. "I was running a tray to Or 7. The footage shows you entering the restricted corridor 7 minutes before the incident." He said it without inflection, not accusing, reporting. "That's what it shows. What the investigators will see when they pull it in the morning." He paused again. "He's offering you a choice. You can stay here, answer questions from people who won't believe you, and hope the right person eventually figures out the footage was doctored. Or you can come with us, help us find what was taken, and walk away from this cleanly." Alara looked past him toward the corridor. Dante was standing 20 feet away, not looking at her, talking to one of his men in a low, controlled voice, while 2 others worked at their phones. 3 men were unconscious on the floor, not dead. She could see the chest movement from here. Someone had been methodical about that. Could have been permanent. Wasn't. That detail registered somewhere in the back of her mind, and stuck there. "If I say no," she asked. The man with the scarred eyebrow was quiet for a moment. "Then we leave, and you stay. And whatever happens to you next is between you and the investigation." It wasn't a threat. That was the strange part. It was just a description of what would occur. Alara looked at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. She didn't know exactly when. "Fine," she said. "But I need my bag." They moved through parts of St. Mercy she hadn't known existed. Service corridors below the service corridors. Maintenance tunnels that had been built when the hospital was a different building with a different name, running east toward the river district. The man with the scarred eyebrow, she eventually got his name out of him in the clipped, reluctant way that seemed to be the default communication style in this group. It was Kovacs, stayed close but not crowding. 2 others moved ahead. Dante walked 3 steps behind her. She could feel that, the 3 steps. She wasn't sure why it felt deliberate, but it did. "You could have left me there," she said, without turning around. "Yes," Dante said. "Why didn't you?" He didn't answer immediately. The tunnel bent left, and she kept walking, listening to the sound of water moving somewhere in the infrastructure above them, pipes running with the night's rain. "The bracelet," he said finally. "It's a hospital bracelet. I grabbed it off a supply desk because I needed surgical access clearance. I know what it is." A pause. "I know what the name on it is." She stopped walking. The 2 men ahead of her stopped as well, looking back. Kovacs was very still. Dante came up beside her, not in front, beside, and she turned enough to see his face in the low-maintenance lighting. He wasn't looking at her with any particular intensity. He was looking at the middle distance, like he was working something out and had temporarily lost track of the conversation. "Alara Voss," he said. The way someone reads a name off a document they've seen before. You were a nursing resident at County General 15 years ago.
You work nights.
Her throat tightened. Lots of nurses work nights. You were the one who pulled a 17-year-old off an intake gurney who'd been written off as DOA and found a pulse the attending had missed. He said it quietly. No drama. They were getting ready to call it. You put your hand on his sternum and felt something, and you refused to let them close the curtain. She had forgotten. Not entirely. You didn't entirely forget something like that, but she'd pushed it far enough back that it had become the category of memory that exists as fact rather than feeling. She remembered the shift. She remembered the kid. She remembered the argument with the attending, which she had not won through eloquence but through sheer immovability. She hadn't moved from that bedside until he'd listened. She hadn't known his name. He'd been transferred before she could find out. That was you, she said. Dante looked at her then. That was me. The tunnel was quiet except for the water. I've spent considerable time, he said, trying to find out who that nurse was. The records were partial. The hospital went through a system migration that year, and a lot of the night shift intake logs were corrupted. He paused. I wasn't looking to make it sentimental. I wanted to know who she was. That's all. Some things you want to know the shape of. Alara studied his face. And then I walked into you, carrying a tray of surgical instruments. At 2:13 in the morning. At 2:13 in the morning, Dante's jaw moved. Not quite a smile. Not the architecture of one, anyway. The universe has a very specific sense of humor, he said. Or no sense at all. I haven't decided. She turned and kept walking. After a second, he fell into step 3 paces behind her again. They came up through a building that had once been a commercial laundry. The kind of place that smelled permanently of industrial soap and steam, even when nothing was running. The smell baked into the concrete over decades. There was a floor above the main level that had been converted. She didn't know when, or by whom, and decided she didn't need to know into something functional. Not comfortable. Functional. Work tables. Screens. Cables running along walls in the organized way that meant someone with standards had done the wiring. 3 people were already working when they arrived. They looked up when Dante came in, and then immediately looked back at their screens, which told her something about what his attention cost people. Alara sat down in the chair Kovacs indicated and pulled her bag onto her lap and looked around the room. Case, she said. What was in it? Kovacs glanced at Dante. Dante was at the nearest work table, looking at something on a screen, with one of the 3 people who'd already been there. He didn't turn around when he answered. Evidence. 12 years of documented criminal activity across 7 connected organizations. Financial records. Recordings. He paused. The identities of individuals operating inside federal agencies on behalf of those organizations. Ilara processed that. Someone stole 12 years of evidence. Someone already knew where it was. He did turn around then, which means someone inside the convoy knew the route and the timing, which means the attack tonight wasn't random, and it wasn't opportunistic. He paused again, and the footage showing you in that corridor, 7 minutes early, means whoever planned this wanted a body to attach to it. Me. Someone who would be easy to disbelieve, he said. It wasn't cruel. It was analytical. A nurse with no connections. No organization behind her. No resources to fight an investigation. Alara looked at him for a long moment. You're describing me like I'm a convenient piece of a puzzle. You are a convenient piece of a puzzle. That's not a comment on your value as a person. It's a description of how someone else is using you. He held her gaze. The difference matters. She looked down at her bag. Her hands were on the zipper, and she was aware, in a way she'd been managing not to be for the last 40 minutes, of what was inside it. Not instruments, not spare gloves or a granola bar, or the usual accumulation of a long shift. A small encrypted hard drive, a portable scanner, 3 sets of carefully labeled memory cards in a zippered interior pocket, 11 years of her own documentation. She'd started collecting it. The year she finished her residency. The year she'd finally understood enough about the criminal ecosystem her father had died inside, to know that understanding it wasn't enough. You needed proof. You needed specificity. You needed the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away by a decent attorney in 40 minutes. She'd been slow about it. Patient, she'd cultivated sources the way a gardener cultivates things that take years quietly without announcing what you're growing. Medical workers moved through every layer of a city. They sat with people at their most vulnerable. People talked. People left things behind. People assumed that someone in scrubs was too busy to be paying attention. Alara had always been paying attention. She looked up. Dante was watching her bag. Not in the aggressive, accusatory way she might have expected. In the way someone watches a thing they've seen before and are filing into a larger picture. "What's on the drive?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Ilara's fingers tightened on the zipper. Patient data. No. Medical. No. He crossed to the table and sat down across from her, and his voice stayed level the way very still. Water stays level. Eek. I know what evidence looks like. I know what someone who has been collecting it for a long time looks like. The way you're holding that bag is the way people hold the only thing they'd run back into a burning building for. He waited. What's on the drive? She looked at him for a long time. The thing about Dante Rourke, the thing she was beginning to understand, sitting across from him in a converted laundry at 3 a.m, was that he wasn't threatening her. He was negotiating. And the negotiation had the specific quality of one conducted by someone who already knows a significant portion of the answer and is offering you the courtesy of filling in the rest. Documentation, she said finally. 11 years. Financial records, movement logs, testimony transcripts, not the kind taken in court. Kind taken in hallways and waiting rooms and recovery bays by someone who understood that what people say when they're frightened and hurting is usually closer to the truth than what they say to lawyers. He didn't move. "I've been building a case," she said, "against the network that killed my father." The room was very quiet. One of the 3 workers at the other tables had stopped typing. "Victor Voss," Dante said. Alara went still. "You know his name." "I know your father's name, because his name appears 17 times in 12 years of documentation currently sitting inside a stolen evidence case that someone just pulled out of a federal courier." His voice remained level. Victor Voss was a financial intermediary. He moved money for 3 of the 7 organizations in that case. And he died in a manner that was ruled accidental. "He was killed," she said. The words came out flat. She'd said them 1,000 times in her own head, and the flatness was what happened when something had been said internally. So many times it arrives externally already worn smooth. He was killed, Akul, because he found something he wasn't supposed to find, and he told the wrong person he'd found it. What did he find? She looked at him. "Alara, why do you care?" she said. "What does my father's death have to do with your stolen evidence?" Dante leaned forward slightly. "Because buried inside that documentation, inside evidence that someone just risked a federal courier's life to steal, is the identity of a person who has been operating inside my organization for over a decade. Feeding information, redirecting money, positioning people." He paused. "Whoever they are, they're the reason your father is dead. And they're the reason my father is dead. And they are currently walking around with 12 years of evidence that tells us exactly who they are." Ilara's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. "You don't know who it is," she said slowly. "I have a name on a document I haven't been able to corroborate. A name that shows up in your father's files, if you know what cross-reference to run." He held her gaze. "A name you've probably seen." She had. She'd flagged it 3 years ago. A designation that appeared in financial routing documentation at intervals that didn't make organizational sense. Not a person's name, but a code. Consistent alphanumeric label attached to transfers that moved through 5 different shell structures. She'd traced it as far as she could, which was to the edge of a network. She didn't have the resources to penetrate further. She'd called the label Silas in her own files because it was the name she'd given the shadow a placeholder. Something to call the thing she was chasing without giving it weight she couldn't yet justify. She hadn't told anyone that. She opened her mouth to say something and didn't say it. Looked at Dante, at the gray of his eyes in the low light. "The name in my files," she said carefully, "is a code, not a real name." "What did you call it?" The pause before she answered was long enough to matter. "Silas," she said. Dante Rourke went very still, and the expression that moved through his face in the 2 seconds that followed was one of the most complicated things Alara Voss had ever seen on a human being: recognition, and the specific horror of recognition confirmed, and something older than either of those things, moving through him like a current and then shutting down fast as the discipline reasserted itself. "Kovacs," he said. His voice was perfectly even. The evenness of it was almost terrifying. "Lock the floor." She didn't understand the full shape of what had just happened until 20 minutes later, when Dante sat back down across from her with a physical file folder, actual paper, actual photographs, and put it on the table between them without speaking. Photographs were of a man she'd never seen. Mid-50s. Silver hair, well kept. Face that read as trustworthy in the way that some faces are specifically engineered to read as trustworthy, open, steady, projecting the particular calm of someone who has spent decades being the person other people defer to in difficult moments. "Creed," Dante said. "He's been my second in command for 9 years. Before that, he ran operations for my father for 6. He looked at the photographs. He's been in this organization longer than I have. And you think he's the one who—" "I don't think anything yet," Dante said. "Thinking requires more than a code name and a coincidence." He looked up from the photographs. "But I know that tonight, someone arranged for evidence to be taken from a federal courier. I know that someone doctored security footage to put you in that corridor. I know that the documentation inside that stolen case contains a name that matches the name you independently assigned to a shadow in your father's files." He paused. "And I know that Silas knew the route, the timing, the window." Alara looked at the face in the photographs. "He would have known," Dante said quietly, "because I told him." The room was very quiet again. "If it's him," Alara said slowly, "then he's not just running information. He's been controlling the narrative. Your organization's decisions. Who gets targeted? Who gets protected?" She paused. "Your father's death." Dante's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough to be visible. "Your father's death," he said, "was ruled a heart attack. Natural causes. He was 63. He looked at the table. He was also in excellent health and had a physical 3 weeks before he died that came back completely clean. My father's death was ruled an accident," Alara said. "He drove his car into a reservoir, they said. He fell asleep at the wheel." She looked at Dante. He looked at her. "He never drove at night," she said. His night vision had been compromised since he was 30. He knew it. He never took the car after dark. It was— She stopped. It was the kind of detail that only someone who knew him would know was wrong. "Kind of detail," Dante said carefully, "that would only matter to someone looking for it, which no one was," she said, "because it was ruled an accident, because someone made sure it would be." Outside, the rain was still coming down. Alara could hear it against the building's upper windows. She looked at her hands on the table, still, finally still. Some part of her body had decided that the shaking was a response she couldn't afford anymore and had quietly retired it. "So what do we do?" she said. Dante looked at her for a moment. Not like he was sizing her up, more like he was looking at a map and confirming his current position. "We find the case," he said, "and we find out what's inside it, that Silas was willing to kill a federal courier to keep from reaching investigators. And if what's inside it is enough to expose him, then we use it. And if it isn't—" Dante looked at the photographs of Silas Creed, the open, steady, carefully trustworthy face of the man who had sat at his right hand for 9 years. "Then we find something that is," he said. Alara Voss had come into St. Mercy Hospital that evening, carrying a badge, a tray of instruments, and 11 years of quiet accumulated fury pointed at a shape she'd never been able to make fully solid. She left through a maintenance tunnel, carrying the same bag, same drive, same cards, same carefully labeled documentation, but something had shifted in the weight of it. Not lighter. Different. The fury was still there. But it had company now. Across the city, in the Eastern Warehouse District, a man named Silas Creed stood over an open evidence case and methodically reviewed its contents by flashlight, pulling files and discarding them, looking for the specific document that would tell him exactly how much time he had. Found it. He stood very still, reading it twice. Then he closed the case, made a single phone call, and gave an instruction that, by morning, would change the geometry of everything. He said a name. It was Dante's. Silas said Dante's name into the phone at 3:47 in the morning, and the man on the other end of the line knew exactly what it meant. It meant, move the timeline up. It meant, the woman is a problem. It meant by sunrise. Dante Rourke needs to look like the architect of everything: the courier's death, the stolen evidence, fabricated footage, and there needs to be enough corroborating detail in the right hands that no conversation he has afterward will matter. It meant that 9 years of careful positioning, of feeding Dante exactly the information he needed to make, exactly the decisions Silas needed him to make, was about to pay out in the single largest act of organizational betrayal the city had seen in 30 years. Silas closed the evidence case. He was very calm. He'd always been calm. It was the quality that had made him indispensable first to Marcus Rourke, and then to Marcus's son. Calm men were rare in violent organizations. They got promoted fast and stayed promoted. Silas had understood this at 26 and had cultivated the calm the way other men cultivated muscle deliberately, consistently, through repeated exposure to situations that should have broken him. He set the phone down and looked at the case. Then he pulled one specific file from inside it, folded it twice, and put it in his interior jacket pocket. Everything else Dante could eventually find, could eventually explain, could eventually use. This one document, 4 pages, handwritten, in a cipher that only 2 people alive could read, this one Silas kept, because this one was the proof of the thing that had started all of it. 15 years before anyone had heard the name Alara Voss, or understood what Victor Voss had been trying to expose, before someone drove his car into a reservoir on a Tuesday night. This one was the proof that Silas had given the order. Alara didn't sleep. There wasn't space for it, not in the physical sense, because the converted laundry floor had 2 cots shoved against the far wall that looked like they'd been purchased from a place that specifically sold furniture for people who expected to use it under bad conditions, and not in the psychological sense, because her mind was running the way it ran during the worst shift, when everything was happening at once, and the only option was to stay inside it and keep moving. She sat at one of the work tables. Instead, her drive plugged into a machine that Kovacs had handed her without comment, and she pulled up her files and started cross-referencing. 11 years of documentation had a structure. She'd built it herself, slowly, the way you build something when you have no mentor and no institutional support and no certainty that any of it will ever be used carefully, obsessively, with a level of internal organization that probably said more about her psychological state during those years than she was comfortable examining. Everything labeled, everything sourced, every connection mapped with a secondary source before she considered it confirmed. The Silas designations appeared 47 times across the full archive. She'd known it was 47. What she hadn't done, hadn't let herself do, because some part of her had understood that doing it completely would require resources she didn't have, was map all 47 against a single organizational timeline. She did it now. It took 40 minutes. When she was done, she sat back and looked at what the map showed her. And the thing it showed her was this. Silas hadn't just been moving money and feeding information. Silas had been managing succession. Every major shift in power across the 7 connected organizations over 12 years. Every death, every arrest, every strategic realignment had a Silas-labeled transaction within 72 hours of the event, not causing it necessarily, but positioned around it, like a hand that isn't throwing the stone, but is very precisely placing the thrower. Printed it. The printer on the table was old and loud and took its time. She listened to it work and thought about her father. Victor Voss had been a quiet man, an accountant by training, a financial intermediary by circumstance. He'd fallen into it through a client relationship in his 30s that had grown complicated before he fully understood what he was inside of. He'd told her that much, the year before he died. Not everything, but enough for her, at 23, to understand that he was frightened, and that the fear was the specific kind that comes from knowing too much and having too few options. He'd said, "I found something. I'm going to handle it." He'd said, "Don't worry about it, Alara." He'd said, "I'll be careful." 3 weeks later, his car went into the reservoir. She pulled the printed pages off the tray and looked at them and thought, 47 times. 47 moments when a hand had reached across organizations and moved pieces and then withdrawn. 47 moments when her father's killer had been operating in plain sight of everyone who should have seen it and hadn't, because the calm was so convincing and the positioning so clean that nobody had thought to look at the hand, only at the pieces. She was still looking at the pages when Dante came and stood at the edge of the table. He looked at what she'd printed. He didn't ask. He could read a map as well as anyone. 47, she said. I see them. He's been managing every power transition for 12 years, not causing events, positioning around them. She paused. Your father's death included. Dante's jaw was doing the thing she'd noticed before, the slight tightening that was the only external sign of whatever was moving through him internally. He was standing very straight. His hands were at his sides, and his hands were completely still, and the stillness of them was a more accurate indicator of his state than anything on his face. Marcus Rourke, he said finally, died of a heart attack 18 months after I took operational control. I was there. 3 doctors signed the certificate. 3 doctors whose names appear in my financial routing documentation, Alara said quietly. Each of them with a Silas-labeled transaction the month before your father died. The stillness lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Show me, Dante said. They worked through the rest of the night at adjacent tables, not speaking much, which was fine because there wasn't much to say that the documents weren't already saying louder. Kovacs brought coffee at some point black, no ceremony, and stood at Dante's shoulder for 10 minutes, reading what was on the screen before he walked away to the far side of the room and made a phone call in a very low voice with his back to the room. At 5:20 a.m., one of the 3 workers who'd been there, when they arrived, a young woman with short hair and the specific focus of someone who thought in code, sat up straight and said, "Got the footage metadata." Dante was across the room in 4 steps. Alara followed. The screen showed the original hospital security timestamp data for the footage of the restricted corridor, the footage that put Alara in the corridor 7 minutes before the incident. The young woman, her name, Alara eventually gathered, was Priya had been running a verification analysis against the camera system's internal clock records. The footage isn't from 2/6, Priya said. It's from 151. Someone pulled 22 minutes of earlier footage, stripped the embedded timestamp, and reinserted it into the 2/6 slot. She pulled up 2 parallel waveforms on the screen. The light temperature is wrong for 2/6. The corridor lights at St. Mercy run on a cycle. They dim slightly every 90 minutes as part of the energy protocol. At 2/6, the light should read at 94% luminance. This footage reads at 87%. She pointed. That's what 151 looks like. Alara stared at the screen. So the footage of me in the corridor is real. It's real. You were really there at 1:51, running a tray to OR7, and someone pulled that clip and placed it in a new timestamp to make it look like you were there. At 2/6, Priya paused. Whoever did it knew the lighting cycle. Either they worked at the hospital or they had access to the facility maintenance records. Dante straightened up, or both. Alara was looking at the luminance waveform. At 1:51. She'd been running a tray to OR7 at 1:51. She was certain of that. She could reconstruct the whole chain of the evening, which meant someone had been watching the corridor feeds in real time, had identified the right clip, and had made the substitution within the 90-minute window before the blackout. That's not improvised, she said. No, Dante said. Someone planned for me specifically. She looked at him. Not just a convenient body. Me. They were watching for a specific nurse, which means they knew I would be there, which means they knew. They knew your schedule, Dante said. Your rotation, which shifts you take, which means they've been watching me. The room was quiet. For how long, she said. It wasn't exactly a question. Kovacs, from across the room, long enough to know about your files. Everyone looked at him. He was standing with his phone at his side, his expression doing the careful neutral thing that Alara was beginning to recognize as his version of genuine concern. I just got a call from one of our people at the court district, he said. There's a warrant application being processed. Filed 40 minutes ago. He paused. For the search of a storage unit registered in the name of Alara Voss. The application cites evidence of criminal conspiracy. Alara felt the floor tilt slightly. Not physically. The sensation of the ground rearranging. I don't have a storage unit, she said. You do now, Kovacs said. Registered 6 weeks ago. And whatever's inside it is apparently enough to support the application, because a judge signed it 20 minutes ago. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks of preparation. Someone had been building this for 6 weeks, layer by layer, the registration, the planted evidence, the footage, the warrant, and had triggered it all in one night, which meant they'd been waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was tonight, which meant tonight had been chosen deliberately, which meant convoy, she said. The route tonight, the timing. Someone chose tonight because the federal evidence was moving. They needed both things to happen simultaneously, the theft and the frame, so that by morning there's a warrant for me and a missing federal case and the footage of me in the corridor, and anyone looking at it sees a conspiracy between a nurse and a criminal organization. She looked at Dante. They're not just framing me, she said. They're framing both of us. Together. Dante moved to the window not to look out. The window faced a window wall, but to stand somewhere that wasn't the center of the room, which Alara was beginning to understand, was how he thought. He put his back to the wall and crossed his arms, and looked at a point between the floor and the middle distance. Silas knew the convoy route, he said, because I told him. When? Yesterday afternoon. Which means he had one night to execute. Which means he had everything ready before you told him. He paused, and she could see him working through it, the discipline of it, the particular difficulty of dismantling something you've trusted for 9 years in real time. He told me he needed the convoy route for logistics coordination. And you believed him. Dante looked at her. The look was level and completely without defensiveness, which was unexpected. I trusted him, he said. There's a difference. Believing someone means you've evaluated the claim. Trusting someone means you've stopped evaluating. He paused. I stopped evaluating Silas a long time ago. That's how it works, Alara said. That's how someone like that operates. They make themselves indispensable slowly enough that indispensable becomes invisible. I know how it works. His voice was quiet, not sharp but final. Then you know that everything he's done in your organization, every decision, every outcome needs to be re-examined. I know. And you know that whatever he's planning next is already in motion. She looked at him. He filed the warrant 40 minutes ago. That means he's moving fast. He doesn't have time to be careful anymore. Dante uncrossed his arms. Because we're still out here. Because you made a choice in that corridor, she said. He expected you to handle the problem. When you didn't, he moved to Plan B. She paused. What's Plan B? For someone who's been inside your organization for 9 years and knows everything. Dante looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Kovacs. He'll go for the alliance, Dante said. The Ferrano family. Silas has been brokering our working agreement with them for 4 years. If he turns that relationship, tells them, I've lost control, shows them the warrant, and the federal connection. He stopped. He doesn't need to destroy me directly. He just needs to make me radioactive enough that my own alliances collapse. How long does he have before the Ferranos hear about the federal warrant? If he's already talking to them, they know. Then we have hours, Dante said. Maybe less. Priya looked up from her screen. There's something else. Nobody moved. The warrant application, she said. I'm looking at the filing metadata. The attorney who filed it. She hesitated. His name is Raymond Creed. The silence that followed had weight. Silas's brother, Dante said, very quietly. Half-brother. Disbarred in 2019, reinstated in 2022. He's been practicing corporate law. Priya looked at her screen. The firm he works at has appeared 6 times in your financial documentation, she said to Alara, as a routing entity for Silas-labeled transfers. Alara thought about the 47 data points on her map. She thought about her father saying, I found something. She thought about what Victor Voss had been looking at when he found it, which shell structures, which routing paths, which apparently legitimate legal entity had been the thing that made him understand what he was inside of. The law firm, she said. Was it involved in establishing any of the shell companies? 3 of them, Priya said. My father, Alara said slowly, was a financial intermediary. The last work he did before he died was a routing audit for a client who'd flagged inconsistencies in their corporate structure. She looked at Dante. He would have seen the law firm. He would have traced it back to the shell companies. And if he traced it back far enough, he would have found Silas, Dante said, or found enough to lead someone else to Silas, which is why he had to die. The words sat there between them. Not dramatic, just accurate, the way a diagnosis is accurate. Clean and terrible. Alara looked at the 47 points on her printed map, at the hand that had spent 12 years, placing pieces and withdrawing, placing and withdrawing, and never once leaving a print that couldn't be explained, except her father had found one and had died for it. And she had spent 11 years quietly, picking up every piece her father had touched. She hadn't known until 40 minutes ago in a maintenance tunnel that the thing she was chasing had a face she'd never seen and a name she invented herself as a placeholder for a shadow. "Kovacs," Dante said. "Get Mira on the phone. Tell her we need the Ferrano communication logs from the last 6 hours, everything Silas might have sent through the back channel." He looked at Priya. "Can you access the law firm's filing records?" "Depends on how deep their encryption goes." "Start." He looked at Alara. "Your archive." The 47. "Is there a sequence that specifically connects Silas to Victor's audit?" "I think so. I've never run the full cross-reference because I didn't have the law firm data to anchor it. Now you do." She was already pulling up the files. 6:45 a.m., the warrant was executed on the storage unit. Alara watched the news notification come through on Priya's secondary screen, a brief alert, the kind that fire hoses out of the court district wire at all hours. Storage unit search, ongoing investigation, connected individual sought for questioning, her name, her face, from the hospital security system, professional photograph, which she'd submitted for her nursing board renewal 14 months ago, and which looked nothing like how she currently felt. Kovacs showed her without comment. She stared at her own face on the screen for a few seconds, then looked away. "What was in the unit?" she asked. "The alert doesn't say," Priya said. "But if Silas planted it, it's enough." "Enough for what?" Priya looked at her steadily. "Enough to make questioning you look like a courtesy." Alara looked at Dante. He was on the phone. He'd been on the phone for 4 minutes. He's speaking 4 minutes. Speaking in a voice she couldn't hear across the room, and the set of his shoulders had changed something in the conversation, had changed the geometry of whatever he'd been thinking. He ended the call and stood still for a moment. "Mira confirmed it," he said. "Silas made contact with the Ferranos at 4 a.m. He told them the federal investigation is pointing at me. He told them the stolen evidence was my operation, that I had the courier killed to recover documentation that implicated me, and that a hospital employee assisted in the extraction." He paused. "He told them you were an operative I'd been running inside St. Mercy for 2 years. The room was very quiet. "He's good," Alara said. "It came out flat. He's had 9 years to build the story. What do the Ferranos want?" Dante looked at her with the expression she was beginning to associate with him, having already answered a question to himself before it finished being asked. "They want a meeting by 8 o'clock to discuss whether the working agreement stays in place. And if it doesn't, if the Ferrano family withdraws, 3 other organizations follow. The entire network collapses. Every protection, every arrangement, every understanding that keeps this city's criminal ecosystem from becoming a street-level war." He paused. "All goes. Silas knows that. That's the point. He's not just taking my organization. He's taking the stability." His jaw tightened. "He's been building toward this for a long time. Long enough that the infrastructure is already there. If I fall and the network fragments, Silas steps in with the Ferranos as his backing and reconsolidates." He looked at the map on her table, and the evidence that could stop him is sitting inside a case that he currently controls. Alara looked at the clock on Priya's screen. 6:52 a.m. 1 hour and 8 minutes. "Then we don't go to the meeting," she said. "I have to go to the meeting." "You can't. If I don't show, the Ferranos assume I'm hiding. The interpretation writes itself." He looked at her steadily. "I have to go to the meeting, and I have to be able to demonstrate in that room that the evidence Silas gave them is fabricated. In an hour." "In an hour." Alara looked at her archive. At 47 data points and 11 years of careful documentation, and her father's name running through the financial routing like a thread in cloth, visible if you knew to look for it. "The 4 pages," she said suddenly. Dante looked at her. "The evidence case," she said. "Priya, you've been going through the case inventory. What's the total page count on the financial routing documentation?" Priya pulled up the inventory, 412 pages. "What's the last entry date on the routing log?" A pause. "August 15 years ago." Alara felt it land. "My father died in September," she said. 15 years ago, she looked at Dante. The routing log ends 1 month before he died, which means the last entry, the thing he found, should be the last page of the log. But if Silas took something from that case, before we could access it, the log is incomplete, Priya said quietly. She was already checking. Last 4 pages of the routing document are missing from the inventory. Page numbers run to 412, but the actual files jump from 408 to 413. He took them, Dante said. He took them because those 4 pages are what Victor found, Alara said. Those 4 pages are what got my father killed. She stood up from the table. He still has them, she said. He put them in his pocket tonight because he's had 15 years to think about what would happen if those 4 pages surfaced, and he knows exactly what they prove. She looked at Dante. He's going to that meeting, and he's going to bring them. Not to show the Ferranos. He'll never show them documentation that proves his own culpability. He's going to bring them because he plans to destroy them. Whatever access to a fire, a shredder, whatever. After the meeting, Dante said slowly. After the Ferranos cut ties with me. After the network fragments. When he has no more use for the last loose end. Those pages are destroyed. We have nothing. Alara looked at the clock. 6:54. Then I need to be at that meeting, she said. Dante looked at her. The gray of his eyes in the early light was very steady. The warrant is active, he said. Your face is on the court district wire. If you walk into a room full of people who deal in information, you don't walk back out. I know. You understand what I'm telling you. I understand exactly what you're telling me. She held his gaze. I also understand that those 4 pages are the proof of who killed my father, and if Silas destroys them in the next 2 hours, the case closes forever. She paused. So tell me what the meeting location is. Kovacs. Very quietly, Dante. Dante looked at her for a long moment, the careful, calibrated look of a man who had spent his adult life measuring risk, and who was currently measuring something he didn't have a reliable metric for. The Whitmore building, he said. East Tower. Private floor. He paused. 8th floor has a maintenance access point from the parking structure. Priya has the building schematics. Alara picked up her bag. You're not doing this alone, Dante said. I know, she said, but I'm going in first. She didn't wait for the argument, because there wasn't time for it, and because some part of her understood that whatever they were walking into at 8 o'clock in the Whitmore Building's East Tower, point of no return had passed an hour ago in a maintenance tunnel, when she'd said a code name out loud and watched recognition move through Dante Rourke's face like a current. Couldn't unsay a name. You couldn't unfind what her father had found. And Silas Creed, with 4 folded pages in his jacket pocket and 1 hour left, was about to learn what 15 years of quiet, patient, obsessive documentation looked like when it finally ran out of patience. The parking structure beneath the Whitmore building smelled like exhaust and standing water, and at 7:31 in the morning it was mostly empty, which was the only thing going right. Alara moved through the lower level with Kovacs 3 steps behind her, and the schematic Priya had printed folded in her left jacket pocket borrowed jacket. Priya's dark gray, nothing that read as hospital. Her own scrubs were in a bag back at the laundry building. She felt wrong in the jacket the way you feel wrong in borrowed skin, which was appropriate because everything about the next 27 minutes was going to require her to be someone slightly different from who she actually was. The maintenance access point was where the schematic said it would be a steel door, set into the east wall of the structure's 2nd level, behind a utility cabinet that had been moved enough times to leave scuff marks in an arc on the concrete. The lock was a keypad. Priya had given her the code with the same flat efficiency she applied to everything, and Alara punched it in without hesitating, because hesitating was a thing she couldn't afford anymore. The door opened. Kovacs went first. She'd argued about that, and lost, which was fine. She'd argued knowing she'd lose, which meant the argument had been about something other than the outcome. Some part of her needed to register that she understood the risk, that she was choosing it with full information, that the choice was hers. The stairwell was dim and utilitarian, and smelled like the parking structure had leaked into it over years. They went up 6 floors in silence, footsteps controlled, breathing controlled. The kind of silence that 2 people achieve when they're both experienced at moving through spaces. They're not supposed to be in Kovacs because it was professional. Ilara, because 11 years of collecting evidence in the margins of her official life had taught her that quiet was a tool. The sixth-floor landing, Kovacs stopped and held up a hand. Stopped. He listened for 10 seconds. Then he moved to the door and pressed his ear against it and listened for 10 more. 2 people, he said quietly. Stationary, left side of the corridor. Silas's, probably. Dante's men would be on the floor above. Ilara thought about the schematic. The 8th floor was the meeting floor, private conference suite, private elevator, 1 stairwell exit at the east end. The 6th floor had a mechanical room that shared a ventilation shaft with the 8th floor's secondary conference space. Pravia had flagged it as a possible audio access point, which was the reason they were here instead of trying to walk onto the meeting floor directly, which would have been suicide. She looked at Kovacs. Mechanical room is on this floor. South corridor. If those 2 are at the north end, we go south. He moved, she followed. The mechanical room was unlocked, which either meant someone had been negligent or someone had been there recently, and in Ilara's current experience, the less comfortable explanation was usually the correct one. She noted it and kept moving. The ventilation access was a horizontal shaft running above a bank of HVAC units, accessible via a steel panel that required a flathead screwdriver she'd grabbed from the laundry building's toolbox on the way out. She was on her back with the panel off and the shaft open above her in under 4 minutes, and she was aware of Kovacs watching her work with the expression of a man revising a prior assessment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this exactly." She replaced the screwdriver in her pocket and looked at the shaft. "But I spent 2 years collecting evidence inside a warehouse district building that had this same ventilation layout. You learn the architecture." She went up into the shaft before he could offer to go first, tight and warm, and smelled like recycled air and old metal, and she moved through it on her elbows and knees, the way she'd learned to move through spaces that required silence steadily, without rushing, placing each point of contact deliberately. Rushing made noise. Noise ended things. The shaft ran horizontally for 30 feet, and then angled upward at 60 degrees 2 floors. She'd estimated from the schematic, and then leveled off again. Counted the cross shafts as she passed them. 3rd cross shaft on the level section above. That was the secondary conference space on 8. She reached it. Stopped. She could hear voices. The meeting had started early. She understood that immediately the schematic had shown the main conference suite at the north end of the 8th floor. But the voices were coming through the secondary space directly below her current position, which meant either the meeting had been moved or this was a pre-meeting conversation that wasn't supposed to be part of the official record. Pressed her ear against the ventilation grill. Silas's voice was unmistakable. She hadn't heard it before tonight. But Dante had described it on the drive over. Measured, warm, the kind of voice that made you feel like the most important person in the room. The voice of someone who had spent decades making other people feel seen because visibility was the most effective leash ever invented. Not asking you to move against him directly. A pause. "I'm asking you to withdraw. Let the federal process run. By the time it's finished, the restructuring will be complete and your position in the new arrangement will be significantly stronger than your current agreement allows." Another voice. Older, rougher at the edges. This would be Carmine Ferrano, 64, built the family's Eastern operations from scratch, notoriously suspicious of anything that smelled like a sales pitch. Current agreement has worked for 4 years. Current agreement, Silas said, was built on Dante Rourke's credibility, which is currently attached to a federal warrant and a dead courier and 12 years of documentation that a judge is going to spend the next 6 months reading. Another pause. "I'm offering you continuity. Same operations, same margins. New face. Your face. A face without a federal case attached to it." A long silence. Ilara pressed harder against the grill and tried to breathe shallowly, which her body objected to. "What about the nurse?" Ferrano said. She stopped breathing entirely. "She's a loose end," Silas said. It was completely without effect the way someone describes a scheduling problem. The warrant covers it. By the end of today, she's either in custody or she's not in a position to communicate anything useful. "You're certain?" "I've been managing this network for 15 years. "I'm certain. 15 years. Not 9. Not since he'd joined Dante's organization. 15. Alara ran the number against her timeline. 15 years ago was the year her father died. It was the beginning of the Silas routing designations in her archive. It was when the operation had started, not in the Rourke organization, but before it. Before Silas had been Marcus Rourke's man or Dante's man. Before any of the organizational structure she'd been mapping. She was listening to a man describe the beginning of something, and the beginning was 15 years before she'd thought it started. She needed to get the audio. She reached into the borrowed interior pocket up for the compact recorder, another item from the laundry building's surprising inventory. A digital unit the size of a deck of cards that Reprius Trio pressed it into her hands with instructions she'd absorbed in 45 seconds. She positioned it against the grill and started recording. Below her, Silas was still talking. The Rourke operation was always a vehicle. Marcus understood that. He and I had an arrangement that predated Dante's involvement by 6 years. A pause. Dante was never supposed to take operational control. When Marcus died, the succession was supposed to move laterally, not vertically. Verano, you're telling me Marcus's death was... I'm telling you, Marcus understood the arrangement. Silas's voice was very smooth. The timing of his passing was unfortunate. The transition was imperfect. Another pause. These things happen. These things happen. Alara's hand tightened on the recorder. Pressure in her chest was something she recognized from the worst moments of trauma nursing. The moments when you're looking at a situation and understanding what it means before you've consciously finished processing it, and the understanding arrives as a physical sensation before it arrives as thought. Marcus Rourke hadn't died of a heart attack. Not exactly. Not simply. Silas had managed it. The timing of his passing. The 3 doctors whose names appeared in her financial documentation. Silas labeled transactions the month before Marcus died. She'd told Dante those doctors' names were in her archive. She'd said it as an implication, a theory, a connection that needed corroboration. She was now listening to the corroboration describe itself. She needed to get this recording to Dante now. Before the formal meeting started, before Silas walked into the main conference suite, with the Ferranos behind him, and the 4 missing pages in his pocket, and whatever remained of his plan arranged around him like furniture. She started backing up through the shaft. She was 6 feet back from the grill when the secondary conference room door opened below her. Froze. Footsteps. 2 sets. Moving to the center of the room directly beneath the shaft. A new voice, younger, tighter, the specific tension of someone delivering information they're not entirely comfortable with. He's here. Came in through the main entrance with Kovacs. Alara's blood went cold. Alone, Silas said. Far as we can tell. But there's a woman. A pause so brief it was almost imperceptible. Describe her. 5'4", dark hair, wearing a gray jacket. She came through the parking structure. We picked her up on the internal cameras 20 minutes ago. She went into the mechanical room on 6. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a very controlled person, absorbing unexpected information, and running calculations behind an expression that doesn't change. She's in the ventilation system, Silas said. Not a question. Probably, the younger voice said. Then she's already heard enough. Another pause. Pull Dante off the main floor. Bring him down here. A pause. Find her. Alara was already moving. Came out of the shaft at the 6th floor mechanical room entrance faster than she'd gone in, dropped to the floor, and had the panel back in place, and the screwdriver in her pocket in under 90 seconds. Her elbows were scraped, and her knees were going to bruise, and she was moving toward the door before she'd fully assessed what she'd heard, because assessment required stillness, and stillness was no longer an option. Kovacs wasn't in the mechanical room. She stopped. The room was empty. He'd been right there. She'd left him standing next to the HVAC units with his back to the south wall and his eyes on the door, exactly where she had positioned him. The room was empty and the south wall door was slightly ajar, which meant he'd gone through it, which meant the door opened. Not the south door, the north door, the one that led to the main corridor, the one she hadn't come through. The man who stepped in was not Kovacs. He was large, mid-40s, and had the physical vocabulary of someone who solved problems with his body as a matter of professional habit. He looked at her without particular urgency, which was somehow worse than aggression. Ms. Voss, he said. Mr. Creed would like a word. Alara looked at the south door, at the distance between her and it. Kovacs, she said, is currently having a conversation on a different floor. The man moved one step into the room, not blocking the south door, not yet, but the angle was changing. Mr. Creed isn't interested in making this difficult. He had a federal courier killed last night and framed me for it, Alara said. I'm struggling to interpret that as gentle. The courier situation was managed, she said. I know, he uses that word a lot. The man's expression shifted slightly, not surprise, but the recalibration of someone who'd been given a briefing on who they were dealing with and is now revising it upward. She used the half-second of recalibration. She went through the south door. The south corridor on 6 led to a secondary stairwell she hadn't used coming in. She hit the door and went up instead of down. Up was where Dante was. Up was where the main meeting floor was. Up was where this needed to arrive before Silas could reframe it. She was on the 7th floor landing when the stairwell door below her opened. She kept going. The 8th floor door required a keycard she didn't have. She hit it anyway, pushed, pulled, looked at the panel. Electronic, no physical override. Below her 2 sets of footsteps on the stairs. Moving fast. Above her nothing. The stairwell ended at 8. No roof access from this shaft. She pressed back against the wall and pulled out the recorder and looked at it. The recording was there 42 minutes of audio that included Silas, describing Marcus Rourke's death as a managed transition and calling her a loose end he'd handle by end of day. 42 minutes of a man who had spent 15 years building something, describing it to a business partner in the flat, comfortable tone of someone who has never once genuinely believed he would be held accountable. Footsteps were 1 floor below. She looked at the recorder. At the 8th floor door, she pulled out her phone. Priya had made sure it was clean, unregistered, a burner from the laundry building supply, and she sent the audio file to the number Priya had given her. 38 seconds to upload on the building's Wi-Fi, which she was connected to because Priya had given her the network credentials, along with everything else. File sent. The stairwell door below her opened. The large man from the mechanical room came through it first, with another man behind him, and they looked up and saw her standing against the wall on the 8th floor landing, and for a moment all 3 of them were very still. Then the door behind her, the 8th floor, door opened from the other side. Silas Creed stepped through it. He was exactly what the photograph had prepared her for, and completely different from it. Photograph had captured the surface, the open face, the steady eyes, the architecture of trustworthiness. In person, with the context of 42 minutes of audio still playing in her memory, she could see the infrastructure beneath the surface. The particular stillness of a man who had never in his adult life made a decision based on anything except calculated advantage. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the evidence case in the east stairwell, with the calm assessment of someone cataloging a problem. You heard the conversation, he said. Most of it. And you recorded it. She said nothing. The file is already somewhere else, he said. Not a question. You're not naive enough to keep it on a device you're holding. He looked at the phone in her hand, sent it to Priya, or to Dante directly. He paused. Won't matter. It's evidence of... It's 42 minutes of audio from a ventilation shaft in a building where you were trespassing under an active federal warrant, he said. Chain of custody is non-existent. The recording methodology is inadmissible. Content, even if a judge chose to consider it, would require corroborating documentation that is currently inside a case that I control. He paused again. You've sent them a recording they can't use. Alara looked at him. The thing about working trauma for 11 years was that you learned to read the difference between a situation that was bad and a situation that was over. A bad situation had options inside it, even if the options were terrible. An over situation had a quality of closure doors, ceiling, margins contracting, the geometries of a possibility collapsing toward a single point. This felt like a bad situation, barely. The 4 pages, she said. Something moved across his face. Brief and fast, and not quite suppressible. My father found them, she said. Whatever they document, whatever was specific enough that you needed him dead, to keep it covered, he found it. And you've kept those 4 pages for 15 years because destroying them means destroying the only proof that you know exactly what they prove. She held his gaze. You kept them because people like you destroy leverage. You hold it, because holding it means you always have the option to use it. Silas was quiet for a moment. Your father, he said, was a careful man who made the mistake of being careful in the wrong direction. His voice remained even. He was trying to document enough to go to federal investigators. He'd identified the routing structure, the shell companies, the law firm. A pause. He'd identified me, by name by name. Silas reached into his jacket pocket. He produced the folded pages, 4 of them, as she'd estimated, and held them, not opening them, just holding them. He was going to go in that week. He'd already made the appointment. He told one person about it, someone he trusted. Alara's chest tightened. Who? His attorney, Silas said. A man named Gerald Holt, who at the time represented Victor's financial interests. He looked at the pages in his hand. Gerald Holt, who was also on retainer for 2 of the 7 organizations in the evidence case. Who called me within the hour? He paused. Your father trusted the wrong person, Ms. Voss. It's the most common way these things end. The stairwell was very quiet. You ordered it, she said. Her voice was flat. Flat the way her words about her father were always flat, worn smooth by 11 years of repetition inside her own head. You made the call. I managed a risk. His voice was completely without apology. Not defiant. Just factual. The way I've managed every risk for 15 years. And Dante, she said. What you told the Ferranos, that Marcus's death was managed. Dante doesn't know. Silas's expression shifted slightly. Dante has spent 8 years believing his father died of natural causes. He's built his entire sense of organizational legitimacy on that belief. He folded the pages back into his pocket. Telling him otherwise would be gratuitously cruel, and I've never been gratuitously anything. He looked at her steadily. What I'm offering you now is the same thing, the absence of cruelty. Walk away from this. The warrant can be managed. Your documentation can be sealed rather than prosecuted. You go back to nursing, and I go back too. The door behind him opened. Dante Rourke walked through it. He'd come up in the private elevator. She understood that immediately, because the alternative was that he'd been on the 8th floor the whole time, which would mean the meeting had already started, which would mean Silas had left the meeting to deal with her, which was exactly what had happened. He'd left Carmine Ferrano in the main conference suite to come and manage a loose end personally. Dante looked at Silas, at the pocket where the 4 pages were, at Alara. His face was doing the thing she'd seen in the maintenance tunnel, that flicker of processing, rapid and contained, reading the room in 2 seconds and assembling it into a picture. Kovacs is downstairs, he said. His voice was very level. 2 of your men are with him. He's fine, Silas said. I know he's fine. You need him fine in case this conversation goes somewhere you don't want it to go. Dante took 1 step into the landing. He looked at Silas with the specific expression of a man who has spent 8 years trusting someone and is standing in the wreckage of it. Not rage, something colder and more permanent than rage. My father. Silas's expression didn't change. Tell me about my father, Dante said. Dante, tell me about my father. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Silas looked at him the way he'd looked at the evidence case, cataloging, assessing, running the calculation of what the next sentence cost and what it bought. Marcus made a decision, Silas said finally. At the end, he decided the arrangement we'd built was no longer something he wanted to maintain. He decided he was going to restructure, cut the connected organizations loose, operate independently. A pause. Told me he was going to cooperate with investigators, that he'd made arrangements. Silas looked at him steadily. Couldn't allow that. Dante was very still. He was 63, Silas said. He'd lived a full life. The transition was handled with. Dante hit him. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't telegraphed. 1 second, Dante was standing 3 feet away with his hands at his sides, and the next his right hand was moving and Silas was against the wall, the call with his collar and Dante's grip, and the impact of the wall had driven the air out of him in a sharp exhale. Dante held him there, not hitting him again, just holding the grip on the collar tight enough that the fabric pulled. Silas, to his credit, didn't panic. He breathed through it. He looked at Dante with those steady eyes and waited. You killed him, Dante said. His voice was very quiet. You sat at my table for 8 years, and you killed him. I protected the organization, Silas said. The organization that kept 300 people employed and a city from eating itself. The organization you've been running on the foundation I built. His voice remained even despite the grip. Everything you have is because of decisions I made. Everything I have, Dante said, is because my father built something that you hollowed out from the inside. Your father was going to destroy it. My father was going to walk away from it. There's a difference. Not from where I was standing. Dante let go of his collar. He stepped back. The deliberateness of the step back, the choice to put distance between them rather than continue, was somehow more frightening than the grip had been. He looked at Alara. The recording, he said. Priya has it. It's inadmissible, Silas said, straightening his collar. The chain of custody is a problem for trial, Dante said. Right now it's a problem for Carmine Ferran, who is sitting in a conference room upstairs, and who is a careful man who doesn't like surprises. He looked at Silas, which is why Priya is sending it to his personal device right now. Silas went still. You left the meeting to manage a loose end, Dante said. You left Carmine alone in a conference room for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is enough time for a careful man to receive an audio file and listen to enough of it to understand what he's been told about me was a construction. He paused, and enough to understand what you said about managing timely deaths. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The calculations were visible not on his face, but in the quality of the stillness. The rapid internal accounting of a man determining what remains usable. 4 pages, he said. Keep them, Dante said, or burn them. It doesn't change what Carmen just heard. He looked at Alara. We need to go. She was already moving. Behind them, Silas Creed stood on the 8th floor landing of the Whitmore Building's East Tower and held 4 folded pages in his jacket pocket and understood, for the first time in 15 years, that he'd miscalculated. Not in the planning. The planning had been meticulous. In the variable. He'd planned for Dante. He'd planned for the organization, for the Ferranos, for the federal process, the warrant and the footage and the evidence case. He'd planned for every piece of the board. He hadn't planned for a trauma nurse who had spent 11 years building a case with no resources and no institutional support and no certainty that any of it would ever matter, purely because her father had trusted the wrong person on a Tuesday night 15 years ago, and she had never once, all that time, decided to stop. He reached for his phone and made the call that changed everything from a managed collapse into something uglier, faster, and significantly harder to survive. He said, "Take her." The word traveled faster than they could move. Alara heard it before she understood it. A change in the quality of the building's silence, the way a room sounds different when the people in it have received new instructions. They were on the 7th floor landing. Dante 2 steps ahead of her, moving toward the private elevator, when the door at the bottom of the stairwell below slammed hard enough to bounce off the wall. Dante grabbed her arm and pulled her through the 7th floor door before the footsteps reached the 2nd landing. Corridor on 7 was empty. Office space, unoccupied at this hour, glass-fronted rooms on both sides, chairs pushed in at conference tables, a specific stillness of a floor that belongs to daytime people. They moved fast without running, because running made noise and noise told people where to aim. Elevator, Dante said. They'll have someone on the lobby. Not the main elevator. He turned left at the corridor's midpoint, toward a service alcove she hadn't seen on the schematic. Building has a freight elevator on the west face. Priya found it when she pulled the schematics. I didn't tell Silas, because I didn't tell Silas anything after 4A. That I didn't have to. She filed that away, the detail that Dante had been running his own parallel precautions, that the trust had been fracturing in him before she'd put a name to it, that some part of him had known and hadn't known simultaneously, the way you know a tooth is bad before you let yourself confirm it. The freight elevator was where he said. Heavy doors, slow mechanism, the kind of lift that moved building materials and didn't care how long it took. Dante hit the call button and they stood in the alcove and listened to the corridor. Footsteps on the main floor, moving systematically, not running, searching. Someone who knew the floor layout. The elevator arrived with a sound like a reluctant exhale. They got in. Dante hit the parking structure level. The doors closed. Ilara looked at the gap above the doors while the elevator descended and tried to get her breathing calibrated. Her hands wanted to shake again. She told them not to, and they partially listened. He said, "Take her," she said. "Not take both of us." "I know. That means he's still planning to use you. He needs you in the room with the Faranos, either to discredit you directly or to—" She stopped. "He needs you alive and controllable. Which means he has something he hasn't used yet." Dante looked at the elevator doors. The authorization. What authorization? The elevator hit the parking structure level. The doors opened. He moved out, and she followed, and he kept talking as they moved through the concrete toward Kovacs's last known position, which was the ESA end of the structure's second level, which was either where Kovacs still was or where he wasn't, and the difference mattered considerably. 8 years ago, Dante said, 6 months after I took operational control, I authorized an operation. Silas brought me the parameters of a federal intermediary who was feeding information to a rival organization. He said the intermediary needed to be removed from the equation. He said it was defensive, that the information being passed would compromise people in our organization. He walked steadily, checking sight lines without breaking stride. I signed off on it. Alara kept pace. What was the operation? I don't know the specifics. I never did. That was how Silas structured things. I authorized parameters. He handled execution. I had deniability and he had control. He paused. I found out 2 years later that the intermediary who was removed wasn't a federal informant. He was a legitimate federal courier, a different courier. Someone who'd been moving evidence about Silas's operation specifically. She stopped walking. Dante stopped too and looked at her. "You authorized a killing," she said. "I authorized an operation I didn't fully understand based on information I was given by a man I trusted," he said. "The legal distinction matters. The moral one," he stopped, "doesn't. Silas has the documentation. He's had it for 8 years. Why I stayed manageable. Every time I started asking questions that went somewhere, he didn't want them to go. He'd not threaten. Remind, very quietly, that there was paperwork with my signature on it that could be interpreted in ways that would be difficult to survive." Alara looked at him, at the jaw, at the hands at his sides still again. "That's what he means to use in that room," she said. "If the Faranos have the recording, if they've heard enough to doubt his version, he pulls out your authorization. He gives them a reason to doubt you instead. Both of you dirty, neither of you trustworthy." She paused. "He walks away as the only clean option, which is why we need to get to that room before he does. He's already in the building. So are we." Kovacs was alive. He was zip-tied to a support pillar on the second level's east end, which was annoying rather than catastrophic, and he was very unhappy about it in the particular way of a man who considered being zip-tied to a pillar a professional embarrassment rather than a physical inconvenience. Dante had a folding blade that handled the ties in 4 seconds, and Kovacs spent the next 30 seconds rotating his wrists and reassessing the people who'd done it with an expression that suggested future meetings would go differently. "How many?" Dante said. 3 on this level. "At least 2 more on 8. Kovacs looked at Alara. "Recording Priya says Farano received it, but hasn't responded. He's waiting to see which way this falls," Dante said. "Or he already talked to Silas, and Silas managed it," Alara said. "Both options on the table. Neither ruled out." Kovacs looked at his phone. "Priya's also been working the chain of custody problem. She says the recording is inadmissible as standalone evidence, but," he looked up, "she found something in the law firm's filing records. Raymond Creed filed 3 separate documents on behalf of organizations connected to the sysless routing structure. All 3 filings reference an authorization code. The code matches the internal designation on the operation Dante signed off on 8 years ago." Dante went still. "Silas routed the documentation," Kovacs said. "He filed it through his brother's firm, which means there's a paper trail that goes both directions. It doesn't just show Dante's authorization. It shows Silas originating the request, structuring the operation, and using Raymond's firm to sanitize the record." He paused. "It's not the authorization that's damaging. It's the authorization plus the law firm records plus the recording. Together they show who built the trap and who got pushed into it. Can we get that documentation into the meeting room?" Alara said. "We can get it to Priya in the next." Kovacs checked his phone. 7 minutes before the formal meeting is scheduled to resume. Priya can get it to Farano, if Farano is willing to receive it. Alara looked at Dante. "He received the recording." "He received the recording, Dante said, because Priya sent it to a personal device through an indirect channel. Furano's careful. He doesn't want official contamination. He looked at Kovacs. Send Priya the law firm documentation. Tell her to package it with the routing cross-reference from Alara's archive and push it through the same channel. What are we doing while she does that? Kovacs said. Dante looked toward the east stairwell, going back up. 3 men on the parking level found them before they reached the stairwell. They came from 2 directions, 2 from the south vehicle ramp and 1 from behind a row of concrete pillars on the north side, which meant someone had been watching them deal with Kovacs and had waited for the moment of repositioning, which was professionally sound and personally infuriating. Alara registered all 3 in the same second that Dante registered them, and the half-beat of recognition before anyone moved was long enough for her to step back and to the left toward the nearest pillar while the geometry was still open. The first man reached Dante, and the other reached Kovacs, and the third came for her. She'd known this was a possibility since the stairwell. She'd known it in the same way she knew most things she didn't want to know clearly, factually, with the flat acknowledgement of someone who'd trained herself to see situations as they were rather than as she'd prefer them. She was not a fighter. She was a trauma nurse who understood human anatomy with a specificity that most fighters did not, which was a different kind of useful, but only if she had a second to use it. The man coming for her was large and fast, and not particularly interested in giving her a second. She went sideways instead of back toward the pillar, not away from it, and the arm that was reaching for her caught the concrete edge instead of her jacket, and she heard him make the sharp sound of someone who's hit an edge wrong and knows it. She was past him before he recovered and moving toward the stairwell door, and she hit it with both palms and went through. Behind her, impact sounds. Kovacs working. Dante working. Specific acoustic vocabulary of people resolving a physical problem at speed. She didn't stop to verify the outcome. She went up. The 8th floor was different now. Whatever careful, professional stillness had characterized it at 7:31 had been replaced by something that moved faster and red hotter. She could feel it through the stairwell door before she pushed through. The specific pressure change of a contained space where something had gone wrong, and the people inside were managing it. She pushed through the door and came onto the main floor corridor and immediately understood 2 things. First, Silas had left the landing and come back to the main conference suite. Second, Carmine Furano was standing in the corridor outside the conference suite door, and he was not inside the room, which meant the meeting had not resumed, which meant something had interrupted it. Furano was 64 and built thickly, with gray hair cut short and the eyes of a man who'd spent 4 decades in an industry where misreading people had permanent consequences. He was looking at his phone. He looked up when she came through the stairwell door, and his expression did something complicated, not alarm, assessment. He looked at her the way he'd looked at his phone, cataloging. "You're the nurse," he said. "I'm the nurse." She was breathing harder until the light changed. She was breathing harder than she wanted to be, and her scraped elbows were making themselves known through the jacket fabric, and she was aware that she looked exactly like someone who'd come through a ventilation shaft and a parking structure. Confrontation in the last 40 minutes, which was not the ideal presentation for this conversation, kept her voice even. "You received an audio file." "I received an audio file," Furano said. "And then I received a document package. And then Silas came back into the room and told me both had been fabricated by a federal operative embedded in Dante's organization." He paused. "And then he gave me documentation showing Dante authorization of an operation 8 years ago." He looked at her. "So I came out here to think. The authorization shows Silas's fingerprints, if you have the law firm records," Alara said. "The same law firm that filed documents for 3 of the connected organizations. The same firm that employed Silas's brother. The same—" "I know what the documents show," Furano said. "I've been in this business for 40 years. I know what a frame looks like, and I know what a genuine record looks like, and I know what it looks like when someone is trying to tell me which is which in a corridor outside a meeting room while Silas Creed is inside it, waiting for my answer." He looked at her steadily. "What I'm trying to determine is who benefits from my indecision." "Silas does," she said. "Every minute you're out here is a minute he's managing the room. Or every minute I go back in there is a minute I'm inside a situation I don't fully understand." He paused. Your father was Victor Voss. She went still. I knew Victor, Ferrano said. Not well. He handled financial routing for 2 organizations I had peripheral dealings with. He was a careful man. He paused. I heard he died in an accident. He was killed, Alara said, because he found the law firm records, because he was going to take them to federal investigators. Because someone in his confidence told Silas he was going to do it, and Silas managed the problem. She held Ferrano's gaze. The same way Silas managed Marcus Rourke 18 months into Dante's tenure. The same way he's been managing every inconvenient piece of this for 15 years. Ferrano was quiet. The conference suite door opened. Silas looked at both of them with the specific expression of a man who has calculated the cost of every second he spent in another room and is now doing the arithmetic on what it bought. Carmine, he said, we should finish the conversation. I think, Ferrano said slowly, we're having it out here. Something shifted in Silas's face. Barely, but Alara was watching for it. Stairwell door opened behind her. Dante came through it. Kovacs behind him, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd taken a hit and was operating through it. Dante looked at the corridor at Ferrano, at Silas, at Alara between them and read it in 2 seconds. He walked to stand beside Alara. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, and the standing was a statement that required no elaboration. Silas looked at them, at Dante specifically. This is already over, he said. His voice was still controlled, but something in the quality had changed. The smoothness had a hairline fracture in it. Audible if you knew what smooth usually sounded like on him. The authorization exists. The federal connection to this woman exists. You walked into a trap that's been assembled for 8 years. You killed my father, Dante said. The corridor was very quiet. You killed him, Dante said again. Not louder. Exactly the same volume, which made it worse. You sat across from me at dinner 4 nights after his funeral and told me he'd gone peacefully and that he'd been proud of what I was building. You said that. His jaw was tight, and all of it was you. Silas looked at him for a moment. Marcus made a choice that would have destroyed everything. He made a choice to walk away from it, to cooperate, to destroy 300 livelihoods, Silas said. To hand investigators a map to every organization this network had spent decades building. To stop. Dante said. He wanted to stop, and you killed him for it. Silas's expression finally did something uncontrolled. Not guilt. Alara was watching for guilt, and it wasn't there. What moved across his face was something older and more honest than guilt. It was the specific frustration of a man who has never understood why wanting to stop is considered a legitimate reason to do so. The 4 pages, Alara said. Silas looked at her. You've had them for 15 years, she said. You've had them because you needed the proof of what my father found as insurance. Because the moment they surfaced without your control, everything you've built on top of what he discovered becomes visible. She took a step toward him. Give me the pages. They don't help you, he said. The chain of custody on your confession is the same as the chain on those pages, she said. Both inadmissible, both useless in a courtroom. She kept his gaze. Carmine Ferrano is standing right here, and he knew my father, and he's been in this business for 40 years, and he doesn't need a chain of custody. He needs to know what's true. Ferrano hadn't moved. Silas looked at him. The calculation was visible now, the rapid internal accounting, the remaining usable assets, the closing margins. Carmen, he started. Give her the pages, Ferrano said. The silence lasted 6 seconds. Alara counted them. Then Silas reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded pages and held them. He looked at them once, the way someone looks at a thing they've carried a long time before putting it down. Then the man beside him, one of his own, who'd been standing at the conference suite door the whole time, moved. Not toward Alara, not toward Dante. He grabbed Alara's arm from behind, fast, and she had half a second of pure animal response, pulling against the grip. The instinct to twist before the arm was around her, and the object pressed to the side of her head was cold and specific and unmistakable. Corridor went absolutely still. Dante stopped. Kovacs stopped. Ferrano was very still. Silas looked at the man holding Alara, and his expression was doing something she couldn't read from this angle, but she felt the quality of his hesitation. This hadn't been the plan. She could feel that. The man behind her had made a decision that wasn't on the original script. The decision of someone who could see the walls closing and had defaulted to the blunt tool. "Let me be clear," Silas said. His voice was back to even. "We're going to walk out of this building. The pages go with us. The documentation Priya assembled is circumstantial without the pages to anchor it." He looked at Dante. "You have a choice, let us leave. Or this woman." "Don't," Dante said. His voice was very quiet. "Becomes the last piece of evidence in a federal case that closes with your conviction." Silas folded the pages back into his pocket. "Step aside, Dante." Dante looked at Alara. She looked at him. She thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong person. She thought about the 47 data points in the 11 years and the flat voice she used when she talked about the reservoir, the voice that had worn smooth from repetition. Thought about the hospital bracelet on her wrist, the night this started, the one that carried a name and a debt and a story that had been running longer than either of them knew. Her right hand was at her side. Her fingers found the screwdriver in her jacket pocket, Priya's jacket, with the tool she'd used to open the ventilation panel still in the interior pocket, because she hadn't put it down and she hadn't thought about it again until this exact second. She thought about human anatomy. She thought about where a man's grip loosens when he experiences acute lateral pressure to the ulnar nerve cluster below the elbow. She drove the flat handle of the screwdriver into that precise point with every milligram of force she had. The grip broke. She dropped. The corridor exploded. Dante moved the moment her knees hit the floor, which was the moment the geometry opened. The man behind her compromised, his weapon arm pulled inward by reflex, the line of sight broken. Dante covered the distance in 2 strides, and the collision was not elegant. It was fast and purposeful and loud, and when it resolved, the man was against the wall, and the weapon was on the floor, and Kovacs had his foot on it. Alara was up before anyone told her to get up. Her knees hurt from the drop, and her right hand was cramping from the grip on the screwdriver. And she was already moving toward Silas, because Silas had used the 3 seconds of corridor chaos to do exactly what she would have done in his position. He was at the elevator. The doors were open, he'd called it, while they were all focused on the man at the conference suite door. While the script was playing out, he'd had his finger on the button in his pocket, the move already made, before the improvisation happened. She ran. She hit the closing elevator doors with both palms, and they resisted, and she shoved, and they opened again. The safety sensor, the pressure, something, and she was inside before she'd decided to be, and the doors closed behind her, and it was just the 2 of them in the elevator, and the 4 pages in his jacket pocket, and the small space going down. Silas looked at her. She looked at him. "You have a screwdriver," he said. "I do," she said. The elevator descended. "You're going to give me those pages," she said. "No," he said. "I'm going to walk out of this building, and you're going to give me those pages because in approximately 40 seconds, this elevator is going to reach the lobby and there are going to be federal investigators waiting there." She held his gaze. "Because while you were in the conference suite, Priya sent the full documentation package audio, routing records, law firm filings, and the cross-reference from my archive to the federal field office contact she's been building a relationship with for the last 6 hours. She paused. Contact my father identified before he died. The one he'd made the appointment with. The one Silas's network never found because my father wrote the contact's information in a notation system he'd developed specifically for documents he didn't want found. She paused again. A notation system he taught me when I was 12 years old. Silas stared at her. I found the contact 8 years ago, she said. I've been feeding them information incrementally ever since. Small enough amounts that nothing triggered a formal case. Large enough that when a complete package arrived this morning, they already had the context to receive it. She held his gaze. They've been waiting for the package. I've been waiting for the pages. My father spent the last weeks of his life building toward a meeting that Silas stopped him from reaching. The elevator slowed. I'm completing the meeting, she said. The floor numbers descended. 3, 2, 1. The pages, she said. Silas reached into his pocket. He removed the 4 folded pages and held them in front of him and looked at them one more time at the handwriting, at the specific document that had cost Victor Voss his life, and Silas 15 years of careful management, and a 15-year-old girl her father and his face did something she hadn't seen it do yet. It registered the weight of it, not guilt. Still not guilt, but something adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of cost, of what a decision made in 15 seconds had set in motion, across 15 years, specific vastness of consequence that begins with one phone call to about one careful accountant who had found the wrong document. The elevator doors opened. 2 federal agents were standing in the lobby. Silas looked at them. He looked at the pages in his hand. He looked at Alara. "Your father," he said quietly, "was a very careful man." "Yes," she said, "he was." She took the pages from his hand, and Silas Creed, who had managed every risk for 15 years with the calm of someone who had never genuinely believed in consequences, put his hands in front of him and waited for what came next. The federal agents didn't rush him. That was the thing Alara noticed. First, they didn't grab Silas, didn't shout, didn't perform the arrest, the way television had taught her to expect it. One of them, a woman in her 40s with short brown hair, and the specific, unhurried quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular morning, simply said his full name and told him to keep his hands where they were. The other moved to his left side. They were professional and quiet, and the lobby of the Whitmore building at 7:58 in the morning absorbed it all, with the indifference of marble and glass. Silas cooperated completely. He'd known from the moment the elevator doors opened that cooperation was the only remaining calculation that made sense. A man who had spent 15 years managing consequences understood better than most people the mathematics of a position with no remaining moves. He put his hands forward and the agent secured them, and he didn't look at Alara again. She stood 6 feet away, holding 4 folded pages, and watched it happen, and felt nothing at first. The specific numbness that follows the end of something your body has been running at maximum capacity to survive. She was aware of her scraped elbows and her aching knees and the cramp in her right hand and the borrowed jacket that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent, and all of it was very far away, behind glass, happening to a body she was temporarily not fully inhabiting. The agent with the short brown hair looked at her after Silas was secured. "Agent Diane Morrow," she said. "We've been in contact with your associate, Priya." A pause. "We received the package." "All of it?" "All of it, including the audio." Morrow's expression was careful, not warm, not cold. Professional, with something beneath it that might have been the specific satisfaction of a very long-running file finally reaching its last page. "We're going to need you to come in. Today. The chain of custody on the audio has problems we need to work through, and the law firm documentation will require corroboration from your archive." She paused. "But the 4 pages," she looked at what Alara was holding. "Those are physical documents. Chain of custody on those is clean." Alara looked down at the pages in her hand. She hadn't opened them. She'd taken them from Silas and held them in the elevator, and held them through the lobby, and was still holding them now. And she hadn't opened them, and she understood why some part of her had been waiting for a specific moment to do it, waiting until there was enough stillness around the act that it could mean what it was supposed to mean. She unfolded them now. Her father's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, viscerally, the way you recognize the handwriting of someone who wrote you birthday cards and grocery lists and occasional notes slipped under your dormitory door during your first year away from home. Victor Voss had had small, precise handwriting with an accountant's obsessive consistency, every letter the same height, every number closed and unambiguous. The writing on these 4 pages was that same handwriting, but faster, compressed. The handwriting of a man writing something important in a limited window of time. The document was a routing summary. Names, account designations, transfer amounts, dates. 4 pages of it, dense and specific, with annotations in the margins that tracked the shell company connections back through the law firm to a single originating designation. At the bottom of the 4th page, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest, slightly faster, or perhaps slightly more certain, her father had written a name, Silas Creed, and beneath it, in the notation system he'd taught her when she was 12, the one he'd called his private language, the cipher he'd invented for documents he needed to be findable only by someone who knew to look a single line. Translated it in her head. It took 3 seconds. "If you're reading this, be careful who you trust. I love you." Alara stood in the lobby of the Whitmore building and looked at her father's handwriting and breathed. She did not cry. She'd cried for Victor Voss in the first years alone, in the small apartment she'd rented during her residency, in the specific solitude of the 3 a.m. hours that trauma nursing produces in abundance. She'd cried until she'd run out of it, and then she'd gotten up and started building the archive, and the crying had become something else, something harder and more durable, and significantly more useful. She folded the pages carefully and handed them to Agent Morrow. "My father made an appointment with your office 15 years ago," she said. "I'd like that appointment completed." Morrow looked at the pages, at Alara. "Come in at noon," she said. "Bring the archive." Dante was on the 8th floor when the federal team secured the building's upper levels 20 minutes later. He'd stayed, which surprised her, though when she thought about it later, she understood it shouldn't have. He'd stayed because Carmine Ferrano was still in the conference suite, and because whatever conversation needed to happen between them, Dante had decided it needed to happen before any other version of events could settle into place. He'd sent Kovacs down with 2 of his own men, and he'd walked back into the conference suite and sat across from a 64-year-old man who'd spent 4 decades building a criminal empire and who was currently holding a phone with 42 minutes of audio on it and a document package that had reconstructed 15 years of managed betrayal in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. She heard about the conversation later from Kovacs, who had heard it from Priya, who had gotten it from a source she didn't specify. It had lasted 23 minutes. Ferrano had asked questions, and Dante had answered them without qualification. The authorization, the 8-year period of managed compliance, the decisions he'd made inside a structure he now understood had been designed to make him complicit. He hadn't minimized any of it. He'd laid it out, the way an accountant lays out a ledger, accurately, completely, without editorializing. Ferrano had listened to all of it. Then he'd said, "Your father was a better man than his choices." Dante had said yes. Ferrano had said, "So were you probably?" And then the federal team had come through the door, and the conversation had ended the way conversations do when the architecture of the life around them is actively collapsing. Sarah saw Dante in the lobby when he came down with the federal agents at 8:34 a.m. He walked out of the elevator in the suit he'd been wearing since the night before. And the suit had seen better days. The lapel blood smear she'd noticed in the hospital corridor had been joined by several others, and there was a tear at the left shoulder from the parking structure, and his jaw had the beginning of a bruise she hadn't seen happen. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of a very long night. He saw her standing near the building's main entrance. He walked over. They stood together for a moment without speaking, which was appropriate because the space between them had too many things in it for any sentence to cover adequately. "Pages," he said, "with Morrow." She looked at him. "She needs the archive. I'm going in at noon. I have a meeting with a federal attorney at 10. He paused. "My own arrangement to work out. Cooperation? It's what my father was going to do," he said. Before Silas managed the timing, he said it flatly, without drama. "It seems like the right place to finish what he started." She looked at him, at the bruise forming along his jaw, the hands at his sides, still again always still, even now, even here. "You're going to lose everything," she said, not cruelly, just accurately. "I know, the organization, the arrangements." "I know," he said again. "I've known since the parking structure, since before that probably." He looked at the building's entrance at the city outside, the morning light coming in through the glass. The thing about carrying something for 8 years that you can't put down, you forget, after a while, what your hands were supposed to be doing without it. He paused. "I'm going to find out." She looked at her hands, at the right one, still cramped slightly from the screwdriver grip. "Your father. I'm sorry. Your father," he said. 15 years. 15 years, she agreed. The lobby was filling up federal agents, building security, people from the upper floors who'd been told to wait and were now being processed in the methodical way of official procedure. The noise level was rising. The particular stillness that had held between them was going to become harder to maintain. "I should go," she said. "I know." Neither of them moved for another moment. "The bracelet," she said. "The night you warned me. You recognized the name." "I recognized the name." "You'd been looking for the nurse for how long?" He was quiet for a second. 7 years, he said. On and off. The records were corrupted. The hospital went through the system migration, and 7 years, she said. It wasn't sentimental, he said. I said that before. You said you wanted to know the shape of it. Yes. She looked at him. Now, you know. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she'd first seen in a hospital corridor at 2:13 in the morning, when she'd collided with his chest and scattered surgical instruments across marble, and the armed men around him had raised their weapons, and he'd leaned close and said the one word that had put everything in motion. Now I know, he said. The federal process was not fast. It was not clean. It was not the kind of resolution that arrived in a single satisfying moment and stayed resolved. Alara spent 4 hours at the federal field office on the day it broke, sitting across from Agent Morrow and 2 assistant attorneys and a forensic accountant who went through her archive with the careful hunger of someone who has been waiting for a document that finally says what the other documents have been implying. She answered questions until her voice went rough and her back ached from the chair, and the coffee they brought her went cold undrunk. She went back the next day and the day after. The chain of custody on the audio recording took 6 weeks and 2 separate motions to resolve, and it wasn't resolved cleanly. It was resolved adequately, which in the legal sense meant it could be used in combination with other evidence without being the sole basis for anything. The law firm documentation was cleaner. The routing records from her archive, corroborated by the evidence case material that the federal team recovered from the locale where Silas had stashed it, a warehouse on the East River district that had been flagged in Priya's research on the second night and raided at dawn, were cleaner still. Raymond Creed was arrested on the 6th day. He cooperated within 48 hours, which everyone who knew anything about him had predicted, and his cooperation added 17 additional filings to the evidentiary record and implicated 4 people. Nobody had previously connected to the Silas routing structure, including a sitting city official whose name appeared in Victor Voss's 4 pages in a notation Alara translated on the 9th day, sitting in Morrow's office. The specific feeling of something clicking into place that had been slightly off axis for 11 years. She called Morrow from outside the building afterward, not because she had anything left to say, but because she needed a moment between the office and the street. Morrow picked up on the second ring. The official, Alara said. He was the one Victor trusted. He was the contact, the one my father made the appointment with. He was the one who told Silas, Morrow said. He was the one who told Silas, Alara agreed. A pause. Your father's appointment, Morrow said. The one he never got to keep. We have a record of it in the office files. An appointment request, never confirmed, from 15 years ago. Another pause. I pulled it when your archive came in. His name on it. The date. Alara stood on the sidewalk in the thin October light and looked at the people moving past her and breathed. He got close, Morrow said. He got close, Alara said. So did you. She didn't respond to that. She thanked Morrow and hung up and stood there for another minute, not going anywhere, just occupying the sidewalk and the light and the specific sensation of a weight that has been redistributed rather than removed, still there, still real, but differently distributed across a body that has reorganized itself around carrying it. Then she went back to work. She returned to St. Mercy on the 14th day. The nursing director had called her on day 3 to say her position was secure. The hospital administration had reviewed the investigation materials. The warrant had been vacated, the fabricated footage flagged and removed from all official records. Call had been professional and slightly awkward in the way of institutional communication about situations that the institution's language hadn't been built to handle. She'd said thank you and hung up and not thought about it again until the 14th day, when she put on clean scrubs and drove to the hospital in the early morning and walked through the emergency entrance and stood for a moment in the corridor where it had started. The marble floor, the corner she'd come around, the space where the tray had scattered. Someone had put a new cart there, supply cart, parked against the wall in the spot where Dante's men had been standing. She looked at it and thought about the specific comedy of the universe that Dante had mentioned in the maintenance tunnel, or the specific absence of comedy, and decided it was somewhere in between. She was 3 bays into her shift when the attending on 7 paged her for a consult, a patient in recovery from thoracic surgery, post-op complications. The attending wanted a second opinion on the cardiac readings before he escalated. She went up, and looked at the readings and told him what she thought. And he listened. And they adjusted the protocol, and the patient stabilized within the hour. She stood at the nursing station afterward, filling in the chart, and thought, this is what the hands were supposed to be doing. She thought about Dante saying it about himself. The thing about forgetting what your hands were supposed to be doing without the weight, and understood it differently now, having said it about herself in her own interior language. There was a version of the last 11 years. There was a version of the last 11 years in which she'd been so organized around the archive and the documentation and the Silas designations that she'd lost track of what she'd been doing it for. Not justice in the abstract. Not even her father in the abstract. Something more daily than that. Something more specific. The right to stand at a nursing station and fill in a chart without carrying the weight of an unsettled account. The right to let the work be enough. She filed the chart and went to Bay 11. 3 months passed. Silas Creed entered a formal plea in the 8th week. The negotiation around the plea took 4 days of back and forth that Alara wasn't party to and didn't particularly want to be Morrow. Gave her summaries, periodic updates, procedural skeleton of a process that was doing its work without requiring her participation at every stage. Plea covered the courier's death, the framing operation, the documented conspiracy across 7 organizations, and this was the piece that took the longest to formalize. Piece where the attorneys on both sides spent the most time in careful language, the death of Victor Voss. They couldn't charge it as murder. The evidentiary chain was 15 years old and had gaps that the Forbrages helped fill, but didn't fully close. What they could charge, what they did charge, was conspiracy in the facilitation of a death, which was not the same thing as murder and which carried a different weight legally, while being, in the plain meaning of the words, exactly what had happened. Alara went to the courthouse on the day the plea was entered. She didn't have to. Morrow had told her she didn't have to be there. She went because her father had made an appointment 15 years ago and had never gotten to keep it, and going felt like the most direct available substitute. She sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Silas Creed stand before a judge and acknowledge, in the flat formal language of legal procedure, the shape of what he'd built and what it had cost. He was still calm. She'd expected that. The calm was too structural to be broken by a courtroom. It was the architecture of the man. The thing that had made him useful and dangerous, and ultimately, in the specific way of very controlled people, incapable of seeing the one variable he'd persistently underestimated. He didn't look at her. She didn't need him to. She left before the session closed, stood outside the courthouse in the cold November air, and called her mother Victor's ex-wife, Alara's mother, who lived in a suburb 2 hours north, and who had spent 15 years, believing her ex-husband had fallen asleep at the wheel and driven into a reservoir, because nobody had told her otherwise. And Alara had made the decision early on that telling her would mean explaining the rest, and the rest was too long and too uncertain to put on her mother's shoulders without a resolution attached. She had a resolution now. The call lasted 47 minutes. Her mother cried. Alara didn't. On this call, in this moment, she was the one who had to hold it steady enough to be heard, and that required the flatness, the worn smooth quality of something said, enough times internally that it arrives externally already processed. She told her mother what Victor had found and what he'd been trying to do and what had happened to him because of it. She told her about the 4 pages. She told her about Silas's plea. Her mother said, after a long silence, "He would have been so glad it was you." Alara held the phone and breathed cold November air and looked at the courthouse steps. "I know," she said. She ran into Dante once in the 2nd month, not planned. She'd been on her lunch break from a 12-hour shift, standing at a coffee cart on the corner, 2 blocks from St. Mercy, and he'd come around the corner from the opposite direction, and they'd nearly collided again, which would have been poetic if they'd both been carrying anything. They weren't. They were just 2 people on a sidewalk. He looked different, not lesser, not diminished the way some men look when the structure that defined them has been removed. Different in the way of something that has been stripped back to its actual material. He was in a plain jacket and dark pants, and he looked tired in a way that was the good kind of tired. The kind that means you've been doing the work rather than carrying the weight of not doing it. "You're still at the hospital," he said. I'm still at the hospital. She looked at him. You're cooperating with the federal investigation. I have a meeting 3 days a week, he said. It's going to go on for a while. Yes, I've given them 4 organizations. 2 more pending. He paused. The attorneys tell me the cooperation agreement holds as long as the information does. It's going to hold for a long time. She looked at him, at the jaw which had healed without visible evidence of the bruise, the hands which were in his jacket pockets. And after? After is a different question. He said it without anxiety, just as a statement of fact that after existed, that it was separate from now, that the distance between them was walkable.
I've been talking to a financial restructuring attorney.
There are legitimate businesses inside the organizational structure, holdings, properties, a logistics operation that runs clean. The criminal framework stripped away. He paused. There are things worth keeping, and things worth letting go, she said. Most things, he said. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The coffee cart operator glanced at them with the mild disinterest of someone who sees everything from a sidewalk corner and has long since stopped narrating it. I've been thinking about something you said, Dante said. In the elevator. About your father. About completing the meeting. What about it? He spent the last weeks of his life trying to reach someone who could use what he'd found. He trusted the wrong person on the way to the right person, and it cost him everything. He looked at her steadily. The work he did, the documentation, the routing summary, the 4 pages that work held. 15 years and it held. It was enough. When the right moment came, it was enough. She thought about Victor's handwriting, the compressed precision of it, the margin annotations, the last line in the cipher. He was a careful man, she said. His daughter is careful too. Dante paused. More stubborn, maybe. He would have been offended by that. Would he? She thought about it. No, she said. Probably not. Corner was getting busier, the lunch hour building around them. People moving with the directed urgency of the midday street. Alara looked at her coffee cup. At the time on her phone, I have to go back, she said. I know. She looked at him once more. Gray eyes. At the particular quality of the stillness that had stopped being the stillness of a man under pressure and had become something quieter and more voluntary. The stillness of someone learning, at 41, what it feels like to choose it. The bracelet, she said. I still have it. The hospital one. From that night, he looked at her. I don't know why I kept it, she said. I meant to throw it away the next day. And then the next day was complicated. And then it was in a drawer, and then enough time had passed that throwing it away seemed like a different kind of decision than it had originally been. Some things, Dante said, you hold on to until you understand what you're holding. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that means yes, and also means I have to go, and also means something that doesn't have a clean translation into words or gestures. Turned and walked back toward the hospital. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some things you carry forward without looking back at where they came from, because looking back is a way of staying in the same place, and she had spent 11 years in the same place, and was finally moving. In the spring, she was promoted to charge nurse on the trauma floor. She accepted without ceremony a brief conversation with the nursing director, a form signed, a shift adjustment. She told exactly 2 people, her mother, on the phone, and Priya, by text, because Priya had sent her a message 3 weeks earlier saying she'd left the laundry building operation and was doing legitimate IT security consulting and had recommended Alara for something she didn't specify, and Alara had said thank you without asking what the recommendation was for, and the promotion had come 2 weeks later, and she suspected those 2 facts were connected. She started her first charge shift on a Tuesday in April. She wore the same style of scrubs she always wore, put her hair up in the same tie she always used, which always escaped within the first 2 hours. She walked the floor and checked in with the attending and reviewed the night's intake and stood for a moment at the nursing station in the particular stillness of a shift's beginning before the first page. Before the first emergency, for the floor became what a trauma floor always becomes, which is something that requires everything you have, and then asks for a little more. She thought about her father. She thought about a 17-year-old boy on a gurney that an attending had written off, and the feeling under her hand on his sternum, and the argument she'd had that she'd won not through eloquence, but through refusal to move. She thought about a corridor at 2:13 in the morning and C-teen, and scattered surgical instruments, and a word whispered close that only she could hear it. She thought about 47 data points and 4 folded pages, and a cipher her father had taught her. When she was 12 years old, sitting at a kitchen table in the house she'd grown up in, calling it their private language, saying, "This is for things that matter, things that need to be findable only by someone who loves you enough to look." She looked at her hands on the nursing station desk. Steady. The scrapes from the ventilation shaft had healed months ago. Cramp from the screwdriver was long gone. Her hands were a trauma nurse's hands marked by 11 years of work, capable and specific, oriented toward the task. The first page came at 6:03 a.m. She went